Well, it's great to be here, and I enjoyed very much the discussion on climate change. And in a sense, I listened hard to that to figure out whether that would cut some of the ground from under our discussion of corporate social responsibility. But given that the emphasis was a lot on what governments are doing and what trade is, what's happening in international trade rules and the like, I don't think there's going to be much overlap. But climate change is just one of the challenges of corporate social responsibility. I remember when I went to business school, I went to the AGSM in the early 80s, and it was impossible to get a discussion going about environmental and social responsibility for business because the general academic climate was very captured at the Chicago school and the Milton Friedman view that the only value that businesses were involved in was enhancing shareholder wealth. At the same time, the Brundtland report started to talk about this strange word, which I thought, as a journalist, was never going to stick, called sustainability. And that was happening parallel in the early 80s. Then, as time went on and also momentum was gathered around climate change, there were the beginnings of books and influence on corporations started to appear more significant. People like John Elkington, who wrote Cannibals with Forks, and who's consulted to Australian companies and organisations a lot, started to gain some currency. You saw companies like Shell, for example, with its experiences in Africa and with the Brent Spar fiasco, starting to take into account the fact that making progress on things like sustainability might be important for their bottom line. Well, the global financial crisis has come along, and in a way this panel is going to discuss what are the consequences of the financial crisis for corporate social responsibility. To some extent, you might say actually the financial crisis is an outcome of corporate social irresponsibility, a failure of the triple bottom line of a failure not only in financial terms but in environmental terms, long-run failure in environmental terms, and also a less than adequate performance in social terms. And in fact, some of the problems, specific problems which may have caused the leverage crisis, which is the global financial crisis, have been caused by social irresponsibility as well as financial irresponsibility. But I'm going to leave that to the panel to discuss. We're very lucky to have our three speakers. Michael Hiscox immediately to my left from Harvard, Katie Leahy, of course, from the Business Council of Australia, and Rick Locke from MIT. And I'm going to really give it to them to make some opening comments about, as they would wish on this topic, and we'll develop the conversation from there, and I'll involve you as much as possible as well. Michael, just by way of very brief background, is Professor of International Affairs at Harvard and a pioneer in field work on consumers and sustainable products, so is right on the money as far as this discussion is concerned. Best of all, he comes from Tamworth. He's been at Harvard 20 years. He received a first-class honours degree from the University of Sydney in 1989, so his research focuses on international trade, immigration, development, and private sector standards for ethical and environmentally responsible practices. Katie, of course, is the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia. She's been in that role. This is the 100 largest corporations in Australia since 2001, so she's seen a lot of the debate around corporate social responsibility come and go. She previously worked as Chief Executive of the State Chamber of Commerce in New South Wales. She was Chief Executive of the City of Sydney. She's a member of the board of David Jones and is also Chair of Carnival, the cruise company. And Rick Locke is Professor of Entrepreneurship and Professor of Political Science at MIT and was recently appointed Deputy Dean of the School of Management. He's founder and leader of the Laboratory for Sustainable Business and Society. He works with firms such as Nike, Coca-Cola and Hewlett-Packard, along with his students, investigating how corporate profitability and sustainable business practices can be reconciled. His research team has had access to all their internal audit reports. This is what you lust for if you're an academic. Sourcing databases, and to their current suppliers in countries like China, Brazil, India, Bangladesh, and many more. And Michael and Richard collaborate together in what is the Harvard-MIT Private Governance Working Group. So, Michael, let's begin with you. How do you see this current state of affairs and its impact on corporate social responsibility?
Great. Well, thank you, Peter. I think there's certainly a skeptical view. You mentioned Milton Friedman and this view that that firms are only and should only be interested in profits and shareholder value. And the skeptical view that I know Rick and I confront all the time is that the corporate social responsibility, some of the things that we see, not just corporate philanthropy, but firms adopting codes of conduct and looking for ways to have their production and their products certified for ethical standards, good labor standards, good environmental standards, investing in green technologies and so forth. That these are all just PR stunt, that these are all just meant to gain good publicity, and that they're not incorporated into the business model in any real way. And on the other side of the coin, consumers have been attracted to fair trade and green products, but that these are really sort of luxuries that people can afford in good times. And if you believe in either of these two arguments, then you think that the current crisis, the economic downturn, is bad news for corporate social responsibility and any of these kinds of initiatives, because consumers won't be able to afford to pay for these goods, and firms that are only doing this for good publicity in good times won't be able to afford to do that now. I think it's more complicated than that. I think there are some firms that we have done some research with that have incorporated these kinds of sustainability initiatives into their business model. And we're trying to do, I know Rick is going to talk about his research, we're trying to do research to sort of investigate what's called the business case for sustainability or corporate social responsibility. And that really, for me, that has two sort of critical elements, and one is, and they're at either end of the supply chain, essentially. So one is in dealing more with the suppliers, and Rick has done a lot of work on this, and what it means when you upgrade labor standards or environmental standards in supplier facilities. And does it, how costly is it to improve labor standards, to give workers better conditions, to better safety and health conditions in the factories? For farmers, if you're sourcing for cocoa or coffee, and a lot of the firms we work with are, how costly is it for you to encourage these farmers to become fair trade certified and to pay a stable minimum price for these goods and a small premium above that price? So working out the costs of these sustainability initiatives, and there's a big debate, a really interesting debate, about whether these costs are actually very high, whether these kinds of initiatives might actually make the suppliers more efficient, more productive. They may reduce rates of worker absenteeism and turnover. In the sort of management side, they may make it easier for you to hire and retain the brightest talents that are coming out of universities and colleges and entering sort of entry-level management jobs. And they want to work for a good company. They want to work for companies that are committed to these things. So a lot of the HR departments in the firms we talk to think that these sustainability initiatives give them an advantage in hiring good managers, young managers.
You're talking about that principally with the end of the supply chain companies, not down the supply chain.
That's right. And down the supply chain, Rick has done more work in terms of what it means to introduce improved labor standards and environmental measures in the suppliers, in Indonesia, for example, in China. And so there's a big debate about, and there's a real push now to get systematic evidence on what are the costs and what are the benefits of introducing these kinds of sustainability measures on the factory floor. The other end of the supply chain, just quickly, that I have been working a lot on with the field experiments is figuring out the strength of consumer demand for ethically sourced products and environmentally oriented products, green products essentially. How much consumer demand is there out there for these kinds of products? What happens to that demand in tougher economic times? And the evidence, we can talk about some of the work we've done as we progress with the conversation, but the evidence we've found, even in the last few months in the middle of the crisis, has been that there's strong support among American consumers for fair trade products, for other ethically labeled products, across the board, and that consumers seem to be willing to pay a premium for this, and there's a sort of a latent demand out there that more companies could be taking advantage of.
Okay, well that opens up a fascinating area. Rick, do you want to take up the conversation?
Sure. Let me just build on what Mike had said and what you started off the panel with, Peter. What we did see at the beginning, certainly in the 80s, 90s, even at the beginning of this decade, there looked like there was a secular trend in business, especially large business, but also small and medium-sized firms, not just the brands, but also some of the top-tier suppliers, seem to be embracing corporate social responsibility, sustainability, environment, et cetera. And now we have this crisis. And I would argue that what we see is a bifurcation of responses. We see some firms basically cutting back their CSR programs, their sustainability programs, their investments in environmental management systems. Seems like CSR, like training budgets, are the first to go. Then we have a second set of companies which are struggling, even in this very tight environment. They're still struggling to maintain, perhaps even strengthen, their CSR, their sustainability, their labor standards program. And they're doing it, as Mike has said, not because they see this as extra, as PR, but because they see it as core to their business. And I guess I would argue that the reason why we see this bifurcation, and of course there's variation depending on the country and the sector, et cetera, but I would see the principal reason for this bifurcation is because how companies define and conceptualize CSR. What does it mean? And what we see is that companies have very different definitions of that. For some, it is, as you said, CSR is a minimalist approach. It's basically enhancing shareholder value, period. Milton Friedman made this argument that if companies really want to solve social problems, what they should do is enhance shareholder value. That's going to generate wealth. When the tide goes up, all boats rise. That's one model. There's another model that said, yeah, that's the core of business, but if companies, for maybe ethical or moral reasons, want to engage in charitable activities, more philanthropic kinds of programs, let them do it. It has nothing to do with the core business. It has to do with some sort of moral or ethical reasons. And then there's a third model, which you referred to, Peter, at the beginning, which is a much more stakeholder encompassing model. And the argument there is different, that companies should engage in CSR policies or sustainability or environmental or labor issues, not for moral or ethical reasons, but because it's good for business. You treat your workers well because you want them to be productive, high quality, retain the best talents. You treat your customers well because you want them to come back. You treat your suppliers well because you want them to stick with you in good times as well as bad. You treat the local communities in which you're operating well because in many ways they're the first line of defense for you, depending on the vicissitudes of policy. It seems to me that the bifurcation in company responses have to do with how they conceptualize on what they think CSR is. If they think CSR is in the first two models, either a charitable kind of activity or only having to do with shareholder value, then I think that therefore in this current global financial crisis, they're cutting back. They're cutting back on training and investments, et cetera, because they have to get the fat out. If they conceive of CSR as a more stakeholder view, then I think what they're doing is they're trying to maintain their investments in these systems because they see them as generating profits, enhance brand recognition, et cetera, maybe in the medium and long run, but they see it as core to the business. That's what I think is really happening.
Now, is this happening across whole industries?
Absolutely.
Or are some industries typical of taking one side of this bifurcation than the other? Or is it happening on are you looking at it more on a business-to-business basis?
So in the industries that I've studied, so I can't generalize from all of them, but the industries that I know a little bit about, which are electronics, agribusiness, apparel and footwear, and a little bit on mining, I see a bifurcation within the industry, not across industries.
Good. Okay, Kate.
Yes, I'm nodding when the other speakers have been saying about this trend from moving from, the business of business is business, to the very simple concept, to now embracing, the whole stakeholder engagement. Businesses, particularly big businesses, can't afford to see themselves in that very narrow, the business of business is business. So they really do want to take that longer term view, that whole stakeholder engagement. And I think what we're starting to see is, even with the global downturn and the general distrust of big business, there's still a community expectation that business will be in there. There is another pressure that businesses feel, particularly big businesses, is government pressure. The first conversation I had with the new Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, with my chairman, was about what is government expecting of big business in the way of philanthropy, and that was the word he used, philanthropy rather than CSR. So there is a pressure from government. Government wants to opt out of some areas and is expecting business to fill that gap. Sometimes we're capable of helping to fill the gap. Sometimes it's beyond our remit. But we also are seeing from companies a much more strategic approach to CSR. It's less ad hoc, it's less of who's knocking on the front door to let's go out and find a partnership, something that works with our organisation, something that our employees will feel engaged in, something that makes business sense, that's logical. And I perhaps use one that I'm engaged in myself. As Peter mentioned, I'm on the board of David Jones, which is one of the major retail department stores here in Australia. And we've particularly, as you can imagine, most of our customers are female, most of our staff are female, so we've engaged in the breast cancer issue. And we've built a breast cancer clinic within the store in Sydney here. It's not in the lingerie section, that's a very old-fashioned term, it's in intimate apparel. And women feel very comfortable walking through there, going to the breast cancer clinic, getting a mammogram. It's all free of charge and the company pays for that. So that link is a very obvious link with David Jones. And I think that's what companies are trying to look for. They're looking for fewer but deeper relationships. They're also much more interested now in measuring the outcomes where they can. And that actually puts pressure back on the partner. So if it's a not-for-profit organisation, we're expecting greater transparency, we're expecting the capacity to audit our inputs and the outputs. We want to monitor, we want to talk with our employees about the outcomes. And I think we've moved away from those ad hoc relationships, and as we heard earlier, it depends on where the company's at, how engaged they are. Some companies are still in, this is a bit of an add-on at the side here, others are totally engaged. When we've done surveys ourselves, 60% of the CEOs of the top 100 companies are actively engaged in this space. The other 40%, it's still happening in their company, but it's not part of their day-to-day engagement with CSR. So that trend is absolutely there. We've seen the move away from just a simple business response to shareholders to really engaging with stakeholders.
It's nothing like a crisis. Can I ask you a direct question? Because you mentioned David Jones. Carnival's the other business you're involved in. And you had the extremely publicised issue of the death of a woman on a ship.
Yeah.
To what extent does that emphasise, does that throw into highlight corporate social responsibility issues?
Absolutely. We've changed our business model completely. And that's the reason why I got engaged in the first place, was to help them change the business model. We were party ships, fun ships. This was the place you came to do a cruise at the end of your HSC, just wipe yourself out for 5 days. Very cheap price too. We've now changed the business model completely to families, people coming there to relax, to enjoy themselves, to be entertained in an adult and professional way. And our sales have gone like that. And it's quite interesting to see a company like ours. We're part of a global chain. Australia is the bit of the empire that's still tracking upwards. So the fact that we've changed our business model, the fact that we've changed the demographics of the people coming on the ships has helped our business. So it goes to the points that the other speakers have said. It can actually be very, very good for business.
And I suppose one of the lessons of that is it was applied too late, the sort of thinking that you're talking about.
Yes, yes. We were happy to make very modest profits on the basis of this party ship model. We've now taken very seriously responsible service of alcohol, security on the ships. We've got more security on our ships than probably anything else that's in the cruise business, but it's been part of the change of both culture and our business plan, and it's worked profitably for us.
Can I go broader again? Bob Reich, the American former Labor Secretary, who's been a long-time academic as well, has written saying corporate social responsibility is a let-off for government. And actually, it's a bad thing because it allows governments to say, well, that's the responsibility of businesses. Mike, what do you have to say in response to your former colleague saying that?
Yeah, I think. I mean, one of the big criticisms that I get when I talk about the research we're doing on fair trade, for example, and other forms of private governance, is that it actually takes steam out of a push to get governments to behave in responsible ways, especially developing country governments that are not enforcing, say, minimum wage laws or allowing collective organization and bargaining among workers. So the argument is that it's sort of a distraction, and it takes away some of the pressure that should be focused on governments to do the right thing, to create the right regulations and enforce those regulations. And so it's a distraction, and it will never achieve what good government regulation will achieve. And I just think that that's a political position, and I'm more of a utilitarian. I think we can, if private governance, if the fair trade model can make improvements now, even if it's only in a small niche, I think that's a good thing. I think that should be encouraged. We should figure out ways to encourage that. It doesn't mean that we can't push for better regulation and keep pushing in that direction. I don't think this is an either-or proposition.
Rick?
I agree with what Mike just said. I think it's a false debate to think that it's one or the other, that this is a zero-sum relationship between private action in the corporate sphere and public action. You need both. The idea that if companies are basically working on a variety of issues, especially if they're core to their businesses, whether they're supply chains or their employees, et cetera, that the idea that that somehow crowds out or undermines state policy, I think is completely false. What do we know? What we know is that states, even when they're willing, even when they have the resources, of which many governments don't have the resources and sometimes are also not that willing, but even when that is taken care of, they actually sometimes don't have the capabilities, the know-how of figuring out where they should intervene in different parts of the value chain. That's what business knows how to do. And so what I would suggest is what we have to do is figure out what's a sensible division of labor between the public and the private sector. It seems to me that companies working with their suppliers, customers, et cetera, they know what kinds of interventions make sense, and they will invest in them as long as it is good for the core business. So that will take care of a lot of sort of efficiency, quality, employment practices, as long as we can show them that it improves the bottom line, it improves their margins, et cetera. That then takes off, though, many, many other issues. For example, allowing employees the freedom to assemble, the freedom to organize, et cetera. It's going to be pretty hard to show that there's a business case for that, that there's strong countervailing power is good for business. I don't think I could try to make that argument. But it is a citizenship right. And that's where the sovereign governments should actually be enforcing them. So there's some things where the government actually should be enforcing the law or should try to make sure that they're implementing the laws on their books, and other things that are best left to the private sector. We have to have this division of labor. And what's interesting about the Reich book is this is the same guy who started the Apparel Industry Partnership, which later on became the Fair Labor Association, which is probably one of the dominant multi-stakeholder initiatives that's trying to promote change in the world.
Don't bother about the contradictions then. Katie, a slightly different issue, although if you want to comment on that, fine. But I wanted to raise with you the difference between philanthropy, the Prime Minister's idea of CSR being philanthropy, and how it's conceived by the Business Council, for example, and by your business members.
Philanthropy is often seen as just a straight gift of money. And I think that's what companies used to do and used to feel very comfortable with. It gives them much less responsibility. They hand over the check and then leave it to the not-for-profit organisation to do the good works. Now, I think it's much more complicated. Companies are wanting to buy into the model. They want to know if they're going to give money or goods or staff time, that it's going to be something that they can feel comfortable with, that they can be engaged in. And as Rick and Mike said, that the employee engagement thing is really very important now. And we saw some of this in the response from big business in the bushfires. It would have been so much simpler for them just to have handed over checks. And within days, our member companies had handed over nearly $35 million. But the bits that were of much more value was the mobile banking officers, the cars that were donated. Leighton's gave portable houses and portable offices. Brickworks gave 2 million bricks. Things like that. The community accepted them more easily, but it also meant that the companies had to think a bit before handing those over. It wasn't just the simple, oh, well, let's give them a check. And I noticed the difference between what happened in the bushfires, and what happened a few years early when the tsunami happened. That was simply checks that were given then. But now I think companies want to engage much more in the giving. It's more than philanthropy now.
Mike, let's go back to one of the opening statements you made about consumer choice.
Yeah.
To what extent is there evidence that consumers give a damn?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence. There's growing evidence. I mean, there's sort of what we know from looking at the market for something like fair trade. So the fair trade market has been growing by about 40% every year for the past 8 years worldwide. In Australia, the last couple of years has been growing like something closer to 100% from a smaller base. But in the last year, the last calendar year, it still grew by 40% worldwide in the middle of tougher economic times. There are still great questions about this. I don't, it's not all roses and sunshine. We don't know a lot about how large the market can become. So at the moment, it's still a niche market that's mainly limited to things like coffee and cocoa and bananas and things like that. And it's still mainly dominated by higher-end grocery stores, small stores, and richer consumers who can afford to pay a little extra or have an interest in causes and try to pursue those interests when they're shopping. So one of the things we've been trying to do is to try and do more research actually in stores with real customers who are spending their actual dollars to look at the effect of the ethical labels and how much support there is and how much extra people are willing to pay for these things. We've been doing experiments with a large US grocery chain. I won't name them because we have some more tests happening next week. So I don't want to blow our cover, but we do experiments with them where they sell a whole bunch of fair trade goods, and they don't really know the value of that in terms of how much support they're getting from consumers for doing that. So we sell in their stores identical goods, all fair trade certified. Sometimes we sell them with the label on the good, sometimes without the label on the good. And we measure the effect that has on sales in their stores. And so far, the experiments we did last November and December showed that just having the label on the coffee, for example, increases sales by 10% over selling the same thing in identical fashion without having the label. So customers in their stores are gravitating to that. They're attracted to the label. They want to support the cause by shopping.
So that's suggesting really a marketing strategy.
It is, yeah. And this is, I mean, the firms we're working with are interested in whether they can build this into their business model, so whether they can enhance their brand, attract more customers by sourcing ethically, whether it be fair trade or by adopting some other kind of certification that ensures that they have a minimal set of labor standards from among the suppliers and so forth. So this is, so far what we're finding is it's good news so far, and we're trying to expand these kinds of tests to a broader set of customers and in a broader range of industries, including in the apparel industry in the US.
Rick, you work with that galaxy of companies. Can we take Nike as an example, which of course has been the headline company in terms of labour markets and labour conditions and so forth, payments and conditions. As I understand it, they source from thousands of companies. Is that a viable model going into the future if they're concerned about corporate social responsibility?
No. The quick answer is that Nike is just sort of the poster child of the problems of labor standards and environmental standards by by multinational companies, but in fact almost all companies are doing the same thing. So Nike has something like almost 900 suppliers located in 51 different countries. And it made sense to their original business model. Katie was talking about the business models and how they changed. The original business model of Nike was to focus in the United States on product development, design, and marketing, and then to outsource the labor-intensive parts. So all the production was done first in Japan, then Korea, China, and eventually 51 countries. And that's because they thought that the cheaper the labor, the more margin that they could have to feed the engine of growth was new product development, design, et cetera. There were two problems with that. One is they got in trouble. They got in trouble because the media and the NGOs basically found some of these suppliers to be engaged in what we see as unfair labor conditions, right? Conditions meant that they paid the wages below the legal wage of the country in which the factory was located. So not Western standards, but that country standards. Or they had people working in the factories below the legal minimum age of that country. And so what happened is a whole campaign started. There were boycotts. There were websites, including the one that's, I guess, Oxfam Australia maintains, called Nike Watch, that basically were campaigning against the country. What did the company, against the company, what did the company try to do? Initially, it tried to, first of all, it denied it, but that didn't work. Then it tried to respond through a compliance model. And a compliance model basically assumes that the problem here is a problem of sort of amoral managers in these exotic lands where these products are being made, and that all we have to do is come up with ever more sort of stringent or careful compliance systems. And what we learned through research that we did and others have done is that that compliance system just doesn't work. What happens is sometimes the factories get better, but very quickly they slip into these kinds of problems. What works instead is when the buyer, like Nike, starts working with the supplier to try to provide technical assistance, a much more sort of capacity building for these suppliers so they can come up with more management production systems, labor systems, training systems. And when they do that, what happens is their unit costs go down, their margins go up, their productivity goes up, their quality goes up, and they're able to make better quality products in the smaller batches that the buyers want on time. This is good for the buyer because they get the products that they need and the terms that they want. It's good for the supplier because their margins go up and therefore they can afford to pay their workers better and not overtax them in terms of overtime. And it's good for the workers because the conditions improve. When they started shifting their approach away from compliance and what I would say is more towards commitment, that's when you saw seeing changes. And I would say that Nike, like so many other brands, are going to keep on moving in this direction because, again, the global supply chain model assumed that externalities like carbon, like logistics, like energy, like labor, either didn't cost anything or were cheap. And even though we're right now in a global financial crisis where logistic costs have gone down and energy is lower than it was 9 months ago, those prices will rise up again, and therefore that whole model has to be rethought.
I'm going to ask one more question. I've got others in mind that we haven't. This is a big topic. We could stay here for a few days to discuss this. But governance, and maybe I should start with Katie. How will the global financial crisis change corporate governance? And are we seeing signs of it already?
Oh, I think we certainly are. I mean, some of it's being imposed, but the issue about executive pay, that's a topic that there wouldn't be a boardroom in this country, I think a boardroom around the world where executive pay models aren't under scrutiny. I think the pay for non-performance has come under a lot of pressure, and I think rightly so. The community just cannot understand when a CEO exits why they would get paid a bigger package than perhaps they got paid when they were working. So I think that model itself...
Other than to get rid of them.
Exactly, exactly. That model is being examined. I think the responsibility of boards versus the responsibility of the CEOs and management team, that's been brought under question. In the US, the CEO chairman role, the combined role, that's been questioned. So I think on a whole range of fronts, governance is receiving a lot more attention. And I think if the self-regulation model hasn't worked well enough, then we are going to see much more regulation imposed on companies from government. So I think it's in business's best interest to try and get the model fixed and a model that works.
Do you think, Alan Fels, of course, is running this inquiry for the Productivity Commission on remuneration. Do you think there'll be some acceptance by big business of a suggestion that maybe there needs to be regulation driving this?
Well, there is already regulation. The fact that companies produce a remuneration report in every annual report, the fact that it's totally incomprehensible shows you what happens when regulation goes wrong.
Yeah.
They're the size of a small novel now, and most people's eyes glaze over as soon as you start to talk about them. So I think we've got to start to look at what actually works if we're trying to give information both to the general community and to shareholders. Then we've got to do it in a form that is understandable.
So Mike and Rick, you're involved in this Harvard-MIT joint working group on private governance. What's happening in the American boardroom as a result of the financial crisis? So what will happen? What's going to come?
So the working group is looking exactly at the issues of sort of consumer side and the production side. But I would just want to echo what was said by two of my colleagues yesterday, both Peter Gurevich and Margaret Levy, where at least in the United States, of course, there was a lot of this kind of self-governance and this was a problem and lack of transparency, but there are rules and regulations on the books already that could have caught many of these issues, and they simply weren't being implemented. And they weren't being implemented for a variety of reasons, either because the people in charge of the agencies didn't want to do it, or because in certain of the agencies over the last 8 years, they saw major cuts in their funding. And so I think that rather than, and I know that at one point there was a discussion about regulating CEO compensation in the United States, and quickly people stepped back from that, except for the companies that now are owned by the state. And I would say that
most of the big ones.
Some big ones, or they used to be big ones. I think that what we want to try to do is not meddle in market mechanisms that normally work. What we want to try to understand is we have rules on the books. Let's enforce those rules. Let's make sure that they are working as they were designed to work, and then we can imagine how we could tweak them, et cetera. That's my view.
Mike?
I think I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to go back to something you said at the beginning, Peter, about the causes of the crisis and how that factors into what we're thinking about now in terms of sustainability. And I think to the extent that the crisis was, that there was a sort of a lack of ethical scrutiny of what was going on, and to the extent that what was going on really involved the primacy of the short term and short-term paper profits over longer-term value. If the cure for that ends up being more ethical scrutiny on corporate governance and more of a way to sort of institutionalize the primacy of long-term value and linking that to CEO pay, I think that's going to be a good thing for sustainability, where really the emphasis is on both ethical scrutiny and the long-term value of these investments in greener technologies, in better ethical standards, better management of the supply chain and everything else.
Would anyone like to ask a question? And as people come to the microphone, bifurcation was a great word to use in relation to the sorts of way companies are going. What about on climate change? Is there bifurcation on that still? What's happening in the United States? Because we've, as our previous discussion emphasised, what the US does is so important to the whole outcome.
Yeah, no, and that was another terrific panel, I thought, last panel around
not as good as this one,
climate change.
but quite good.
But I would say the United States, again, we're beginning to have a debate around cap and trade. And it's interesting that in the last several months, this has become part of the normal discourse of what governments could do, whereas off the table for many years beforehand. However, what we already see prior to any policy shifts are a bunch of companies who have already signed on to voluntary greenhouse gas emissions. So they're basically trying to map their carbon and trying to reduce it. We see investors. Remember, there was an investor network that basically was responsible for $4 trillion worth of investment. They came together and they went to Congress and they say, we want regulation. So imagine bankers going to Congress asking for regulation because they said, we want to have a level playing field. So we have some companies and some economic actors that I think are really trying to push the envelope in the direction where I think is inevitably going to go. And then there are others that continue to basically say, well, we can't do it because unless everyone's doing it, if we do it, it's a competitive disadvantage, et cetera. And again, we see a bifurcation. Having a real policy that would actually be true for everyone, I think we'll get rid of that kind of division.
Katie, in the Business Council, this has really been right at the
issue?
heart of the struggles between one set of companies and another.
Yeah. Yes, I've been with the Business Council now for 7 years, and this has been one of the most difficult issues that we've had to tackle. And it's been quite an interesting journey that we've been on. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, the Business Council was totally split. There was a group that questioned the science, so climate change skeptics. They were just not accepting of anything in the space. There was another group that had got religion. We couldn't sign on to Kyoto fast enough. We had to be out there at the front. And then there was another group in the middle that said, I can't see what all the fuss is about. We're less than 1% of the world's emissions. Why are we even bothering to engage in this? And we couldn't get the three groups together to come up with a sensible policy position. So I'm embarrassed to say, for some years, we just had to park it because we just couldn't get a consensus. And Michael Chaney was the president 2 or 3 years ago. For those of you who don't know, Michael Chaney is the chairman of NAB, National Australia Bank, and Woodside, but had been the CEO of Wesfarmers, so one of our biggest companies. And he talked to the members and said, look, view it as you would any other issue in your business as a risk management issue. How would you tackle it? Well, everybody realised that, this was an issue that was going to come our way. It didn't matter whether you challenged the science or you were right out there and you wanted to sign on to Kyoto. It was an issue that your business had to manage. And depending on what type of business you had to manage it more carefully or less closely. And so the emissions intensive trade exposed companies, the steel, the cement, the glass, the paper, the energy companies, coal, they were managing it very closely. They were watching every move that government made. And we managed to get a consensus that the Business Council had to be engaged. They had to help, particularly when the Labour government came in, had to help manage the issue of an emissions trading scheme in a way that kept those companies still viable, but helped to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I remember when the government first put out its green paper, these emissions intensive trade exposed, the ETs, which is the shorthand word for them, read the green paper and they gripped their chairs because most of those companies would have been significantly impaired. And so what we've been doing over the last year is working with the government to say these companies need to have a future. They're part of Australia's competitive advantage. But how do you do that in a way that allows them to reduce their emissions, still be profitable, still return a return for shareholders, but still keep them in the game? And our Business Council has been actively engaged in this. And I have to say, out of all the pieces of work we've been engaged in, the emissions trading scheme is the most complex, the most difficult politically and technically than I've ever been engaged in. I could do tax reform tomorrow afternoon in comparison with the emissions trading scheme.
So we'll watch this space. Yes, would you like to go first?
I'm Professor Margaret Levy from the U.S. Study Center, and I have an informational question just because I'm new to Australia, and it's to Ms. Leahy. You talked about your relationship with David Jones, and you talked about the remarkable efforts around breast cancer and some other things. But I'm wondering about the supply chain to David Jones and what kind of involvement Australian retail has in the kind of process that we've seen developing in the US and probably is developing here as well, where the big retail chains get involved in trying to understand and do something about the way in which products are actually supplied to them and ensuring that down the supply chain there is some real protection of labor and human rights.
We probably aren't at the level of sophistication that the US is at, but we've certainly been very active in terms of outworkers, so within the Australian context, making sure that products that are made in Australia by smaller suppliers, the right levels of pay and the hours of work are appropriate. Some of the international supply chain issues, we're still coming to grips with those. We've had an interesting one, which is a term you probably haven't heard about, mulesing. This is where certain parts of the sheep's anatomy are removed to produce better wool. And does David Jones sign on to that sort of woolen product? Well, the answer's no. Do we have fur in the store? No. So some of them we are certainly active in, but I think it's a level of sophistication that we perhaps haven't reached in terms of some of the counterparts in the US.
Yes.
My name is Africa Zanella, and you know, I'm sort of standing here thinking of Martin Luther King that said, you know, I have a dream. Well, I have a challenge for all of you. The challenge relates to waste and social responsibility vis-a-vis the corporate sector in which I'm functioning. I heard one of your speakers, I think it was you, Katie, that mentioned that big business relate very well to dialogue and sometimes pressure from government. But my challenge is that the national waste policy in this country dates back to 1999. And some of the issues which have risen, i.e. in my particular area of business, is the tire. Now we talk about papers, we talk about glass, there's been a lot of development, you know, the Australian media industry has to be congratulated for what they do. However, when you talk to big business, especially in the area of mining and mining tires, which are allowed by law to be put into the landfill, and by the same token, we got government saying zero waste, and all the academia sort of talking about the fact that no recoverable waste should go into landfill, that we ought to be looking at the world from the point of view of what can we do with that waste in order to carry forward with a better environment. What pressure can we put to bear to a Minerals Council of Australia or a Business Council, as yourself, Katie?
Okay, can I leave it there? Good. Katie?
I think these issues are issues that business does take seriously because they're often reputational issues. And you talk about mining. I think we've seen some significant changes in the way miners approach their task in Australia. If you look at companies like Rio Tinto, BHP Billiton, they take their environmental issues very, very seriously. They also take their wider responsibilities in the community seriously. I mean, Rio is the biggest employer of Indigenous workers in Australia. 8% of their workforce is Indigenous. It's a win-win for them. They often need people to work in very remote areas. The Indigenous community is there, but Rio has spent a lot of time, effort and money making sure that those people are capable of working on a mine site. The issue of waste is one that I think companies do take seriously. There are a lot of regulations in place. If you think about the issue about plastic bags in supermarkets, that's one that started with a small case study and is now extended across the whole of Australia. So I think we've probably still got a long way to go, but it's an issue that business does take seriously.
One thing business does respond to too is pressure, such as through your question. Can I, yes?
Hello, my name's Chris Hoy and I'm a student at the University of Sydney and also Managing Director of the social enterprise, Who Cares? I've just got a question to the entire panel, and that is, isn't the opposite of corporate social responsibility being irresponsible? So I'd like to take the example to make it a little bit more realistic. Take Cadbury, for example. They responded to a lot of lobbying which came out and said, shouldn't you have fair trade chocolate? And they said, we can guarantee you that 50% of our production does not use child slavery. Isn't it actually the responsibility of every business to be corporately social responsibility and ensure 100% of their products don't use child slavery?
Unusual an unusual answer from Cadbury, if that was the exact terms of what they said. Right. Greg.
I mean, companies, as I said, are very divided. And of course, what we expect is the baseline for them to behave responsibly. Given, though, as I said before, there are very, very different kinds of definitions of what that means in the world. And, by the way, what's permitted as child labor as opposed to not child labor varies tremendously across different kinds of countries. And so what we have to basically do is try to educate the companies, their suppliers, the communities in which they're educated, in which they're operating, to show that it's actually good for business to do the right thing. Having kids in factories or on farms, et cetera, is not the most efficient use of your resources. So we just have to sort of show them that and then try to understand why they may engage in those things so we can understand the root causes. These kinds of things that we talk about, excess overtime, child labor, et cetera, they're consequences of something else. And so what's driving it? And what's driving it are, I'd say, outdated business models. And what we want to do is show them that they're outdated. We want to give these suppliers and the firms the kinds of skills that they need to see that they can compete in different ways, and then try to move them along that way.
Just I agree with Rick completely. The Cadbury's is an interesting case. We're actually doing some research with them now in Ghana. They've committed to convert their entire full cream dairy milk line, which is 20% of their product line, to fair trade certified. And this means, we think, in the next 2 or 3 years, they're going to have to bring about 100,000 cocoa farmers in Ghana into fair trade certification. It's this incredible, large scheme they're embarked on here. They're spending, I think, something like £47 million in the next 2 to 5 years on this, and a range of other CSR activities in Ghana. They're strongly committed to improving things in Ghana. They could ensure, now, there is this issue that they have to deal with the Ghanaian government that's done its own survey in response to criticisms of child labor in cocoa farming in Ghana and in Cote d'Ivoire. The Ghanaian government says it's not a problem. So we've done our own survey. There are no child workers. To the extent that children are working, they're working on family farms monitored by their parents. This is the tradition that goes back forever, and that you can't come in here and tell us that children can't work with their fathers on their cocoa farms. So Cadbury's is trying to navigate this ground where they think that there are some abuses, horrible abuses going on. They want to weed those out, but them deserting Ghana completely to ensure 100% that there's no abuses that filter anywhere into their supply chain is not the answer, and they know that. So they're trying to find a way to work constructively, to improve conditions, to weed out the worst abuses, the worst forms of child labor, but to provide sustainable development in cocoa farming in Ghana.
Peter,
yep.
I mean, I'll say right up front, Cadbury's isn't a member of the Business Council, so I can't comment on that one, but just to go to the point that sometimes these issues aren't straight down the middle. They're not black or white. There's a bit of grey, and it happened to us with the, I've mentioned it before, the tsunami, when businesses wanted to respond instantly and give big checks to that appeal. We had a lot of pushback from the Australian Shareholders Association. This is shareholders' money. What right have you to say that my shareholder wealth is going to this good cause, the tsunami appeal? And so some of these issues are quite complex for businesses to navigate. And we're learning that there are often no rules, that your values and your ethics are the standards that you've got to use as your guide, rather than some rules or some regulations. And I think business is learning, and it's sometimes quite a difficult learning process.
We have a quarter of an hour left, yes.
My name is Bill Leventrosser. I wonder if we could devote a little bit of attention to the rather large foundations that have been sponsored by corporations. If we look at the credits for the McNeil NewsHour, we see various listings. If I remember rightly, the Ford Foundation got into some difficulty with the decisions they made. And maybe the most exceptional case, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. How do they fit into your model of corporate responsibility?
That's a great question. And so for me, those are foundations, right? They're not companies per se, even though some of the wealth originally may have come from those companies. So the Gates Foundation is a great case. What they're involved in is basically around health, and especially health in Africa, and specifically in trying to deal with this terrible pandemic of HIV, AIDS, as well as other things. That's in no way central or core to what Microsoft is all about. But they've decided for their own reason, using their own wealth, to do that. I think that there's plenty of room for that. I don't think it should crowd out state policy. I don't think it should be confused with what corporations do. There is a whole world of the third sector, of which foundations are part of them, and they should be able to do what they want to do based on their causes, as long as they're transparent about it.
The model in Australia is alive and well of foundations too. A lot of companies have got their CSR, but they've also established foundations. If you think about AMP, St George have got one. Many of the companies use them as a mechanism to channel employee giving, which then the company will match, put into a foundation, and have a separate board or a separate group of people to advise them about how to spend that money and how to use it. I mean, companies like Macquarie have got one of the biggest foundations in Australia. It's been going for a long time, and they've got a very, very active staff engagement in where that money should be challenged to.
Yeah.
Well, actually, yeah, my name is Ricardo. My question was a little bit about that, because I find that many times companies don't know where to put their money for corporate social responsibility. And I believe it would be very good if the government had like an institution or something that would give advice about what and where could companies put their money focused on corporate social responsibility. I don't know if that institution exists right now, or it's up to the companies, or.
I think governments have a hard time figuring out where they should put their money, and also there's not a lot of money to go around right now. So I really think that what you want to be able to do is sort of divide things. So if there are charitable activities, which is what we were just hearing about, then companies can do whatever they want, like we as individuals can do whatever we want because we're giving for charitable reasons. It should not in any way be confused with what maybe is the core of the business and what they may be doing. For example, Nike has a foundation. The Nike Foundation focuses on women in sports in Africa, basically. They do that because they think it's a good mission, because part of what they're about is they believe that the world can change through sport. They can do all they want around women's sports in Africa, but unless they tackle the issue of labor standards, environmental standards, excess overtime in their contracting factories, it's not going to matter. So I think we don't want to sort of have a lot of noise that confuses the story. We want to be very clear about what organizations are doing, why, and what impact it's having in the world.
At a slight tangent, I don't know whether you saw the story about the number of prominent North American insurance companies, Canadian and American, including those in the health sector that invest in the tobacco industry because of their good returns. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ariadne Vroman from Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. I'm really interested in Michael and Richard's research, particularly looking at both the consumer and production side of ethical consumerism. My interests are predominantly in ethical political consumerism as citizen engagement, and as part of that I'm really interested in the role of non-government organisations as campaigners, mobilising and informing these new citizen consumers. So what I'm interested to know is if you've been doing research on the role of non-government organisations in the US in this process, and particularly noting the shift from moving from boycotts, Oxfam boycotting Nike, to maybe more boycott campaigns where they might be now encouraging or supporting particular businesses and encouraging consumers, and whether or not that presents a quandary or a problem for NGOs acting in some sort of partnership with business?
Just before answering that question, can I just suggest that no one else join the question queue, and we'll try and get everybody in that's standing now. And we can, because we started late, we can go 5 minutes or so over time. So we've got about 10 minutes to go. Yep.
I think that's a great question, a really terrific question. I think we have seen this shift away from activism that's aimed at catching out corporations in doing bad things. There's still a lot of that going on. It's a hard sort of chasm to cross in that a lot of these groups have spent so much time being antagonistic towards large corporations that it's hard, that I think the real interesting area now is collaboration between NGOs that are interested in human rights, improving labor standards and all the rest, informing corporations on how best to make improvements in their supply chains, and then providing a role as independent certifiers or monitors or auditors to give that credibility, right? To give that teeth. And so we see a lot of those kinds of partnerships, sometimes failing, sometimes going more smoothly. And I think that's a big area where we've seen a lot of activity that is very promising. And I think you're right. I mean, the model of sort of catching companies doing bad things, I don't think works and is sustainable itself over the long run, because what you get is a lot of activity that's meant at hiding bad things or responding to bad publicity with the sort of crisis management CSR teams. And that's not the kind of sort of long-term investments in improvements that you'd like to see.
Can I add a word there? I was at a conference in Perth earlier in the week where this issue came up. There is a compact being negotiated, the terms of which should be sorted out by the end of this year, between non-profit organisations that supply to government, that is, they do things that traditionally had been done by government, and FAXIA, the large department families, etc., etc. And that will be sorted out by the end of the year, trying to actually, and as the head of FAXIA said at the conference, it was a public service conference, the key issue that is at the heart of the compact is about actually developing mutual respect because of the traditional antagonism between a lot of these organisations and government. Yeah.
Ruth Conajuri from the University of Sydney Institute for Sustainable Solutions. I have a particular interest in the role of business in health, and it was really good to listen to your insights on workplace health in particular. I'm just wondering about I understand that about 60% of all people in the workforce in this country are actually employed in small business. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on if and to what extent some of the principles and practices you've talked about this morning are translatable into small business, given the lack of critical mass of employees and the probably perspective of employers that any money that goes to workplace health is coming out of their pocket rather than out of the corporate pool. Thank you.
Me to answer that?
Yes, go ahead.
I think it's very interesting, that question. We've just, as a policy organisation, just brought into the health space. The Business Council's agenda usually runs to tax and emissions trading schemes, education, infrastructure, trade, and we've never had health as a topic. But given the amount of the federal budget that now goes into health, getting up for 10%, likely to increase as we get an ageing, shrinking workforce, we thought it was a legitimate space for us to buy into. And we're also very mindful of what's happened in the US, where the joke is that Ford is the biggest health company in the US. It makes the occasional car, but its primary focus is health insurance. And we didn't want to get into that position. So I think business was looking at the whole issue of preventative health. We're often a very good vehicle for giving health messages to, in our case, 1 million employees. So issues around depression and obesity are companies the right sort of vehicles for carrying that through? And I think sharing some of those experiences with smaller companies would be a benefit to us too. So I can't imagine that most companies would want to keep that close to their chest. The more people that know about it, the better it is for our whole community. But it's been quite interesting just understanding more of the health issues from a public policy business perspective. And there's been a bit of pushback for why would business want to buy into this agenda? It's just for doctors and nurses, health professionals. And so it's been quite interesting that this is not seen necessarily as a legitimate space for business to play in.
Rick.
Let me just add to that. I think that we had a little bit of this yesterday when there was a discussion about small and medium-sized firms as opposed to large business, and we think of them as completely separate animals, and there's very little that you can learn from one to the other, and that's not really true. The thing that we were talking about in this panel about trying to get away from a policing model and much more of a capacity building, sharing, transparent model, that's exactly how clusters of small and medium-sized firms have improved in other countries historically. In another life, I used to study clusters of small and medium-sized firms in Italy, central Italy and southern part of Germany. And there you had labor abuses, environmental degradation, tax evasion, all these things. What happened? The associations of the small businesses basically reached a deal with government. And they said, we will come into compliance, we will provide all these kinds of we'll make sure that our members comply eventually. We need time, we can't do it from one day to the next, so it has to be a ratcheting system. And what we're going to do is give us that time and we will provide the technical assistance to our members so they can become more competitive small and medium-sized firms. Hence, they can afford the benefits, the taxes, the wages, etc. And all of the dynamic parts of both Italy and Germany are built on this model. It's exactly what we're saying about large firms. It's a way of getting out of this kind of, again, bifurcation.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Dai Fortier, and I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for ESSIX, or as in other parts of the world, ASICS. I'm a long way from home, and I'm very glad to be here. I have a small offer for Katie. If you're interested in any of our experiences working with the FLA or similar types of multi-stakeholder agreements or initiatives within the garment industry, please let me know. We're more than happy to provide you with our contacts and our experiences. I wanted to pose a question to Rick, which is, I cannot agree more in your observation that the compliance-based approach to sustainability in our industry is one that hasn't really delivered what we hoped it would achieve. And we're now in this transition towards a commitment-based, let's say, approach. And one of the key issues that we see is the role of suppliers, and especially the involvement of suppliers, and in particular the consolidated suppliers that we have in China. For your ideas, some of which are 5 times as big as we are, some of which are 4 times as big as Puma are, some of which are even bigger than Adidas. So this makes it very hard to, given the bad blood that we've created due to our top-down pressure on them with our ticking the boxes approach, how do we get these guys back to the table and create a common discourse to create, let's say, an industry-based agenda?
Well, this is something that Mike, Margaret, and I are very much trying to promote, and I think that the best way to start is to be honest. And by being honest, admitting that the model that you developed, which is a policing model, doesn't work. It distorts all the incentives. And then to again try to investigate what's behind these problems of compliance. And what I've learned, and this is, I know my colleagues have also informed a lot of my thinking on this, is that the problems that we observe in these downstream factories, excess overtime, poor working conditions, bad wages, etc., aren't just because they're they're bad people and they don't know what to do, etc. It's because of the whole system. And one of the things that we observed in doing our research in a variety of different countries is that what are the big problems? Excess overtime and poor wages. Okay, so where does that come from? So then you start realizing that upstream, the design areas of ASICS, Nike, Puma, etc., they're actually basically placing their orders, right? So the design, development, commercialization of the products is late on their end. So they're placing the order a couple weeks late. So it's a small delay, but it has a bullwhip effect later on. So what happens? It's late, it often gets changed, the inputs therefore have to get ordered, and those have all sorts of delays. The rational supplier is not going to say no to ASICS or Nike, et cetera. They're going to take the order, but they're also, since they're rational, are not going to suddenly build new capacity or hire a lot of people. They're going to make do with what they have. As a result, excess overtime. Also, because they got the order late, they have to ship the product air freight as opposed to regular freight, because they know that if they don't deliver on time, they'll never get the order again. And by doing that, they basically have eroded their margins. So basically, a big source of the problems that are observed downstream come from problems upstream. And we know how to clean that up. And so it's just a question of being clear. Let you guys do what you need to do. And I think if you admit that and work with them, you might be able to bring them back to the table.
We need to move on because we only have a couple of minutes left. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. I'll try and be quick. I found a conversation very interesting. Robert Hill was talking about the crisis as an opportunity for structural change. This is a question sort of maybe about semantics. But John Elkington, in his recent writing about the Phoenix economy, talked about the role of the social entrepreneur as an agent in business, not as an external agent. And what I see here is, in Australia, a lot of stovepiped traditional models around CSR. And to come back to the USA, the US Chamber of Commerce Business Civic Leadership Centre and the International Business Leadership Forum from the UK, which operates heavily in the US, are introducing effective models around corporate citizenship. Is it time is this time to change CSR, the term CSR, to a new term, so that we actually move forward and can affect these structural changes that you're talking about?
Now, can you hold that question in your heads, because it's a great final question, because it asks about the future. Do you want to just come in with your question?
Yes,
and
I just have a
we'll
quick
try and
question
deal
for
with both
Rick.
these.
Early on, you gave sort of three definitions of CSR, sort of a Friedman model, a charity-driven model, and a good-for-business model. And the good-for-business model was, do this, it's good for our employees, our customers. Isn't that just the Friedman model with perhaps a bit more sophistication? Is there really a difference between that and let's maximise our profits?
Okay, that was the final two questions. Beautifully integrated. Who wants to go first? Mike.
I think that's a great. I think you're right. I think that is right. I think that is a more sophisticated approach to the bottom line that includes thinking about your consumers and what they actually want, and this emerging, I think, demand for ethically sourced products. That the products not only have a price and a quality associated with their function, but they have an ethical quality, and that can be defined, that can be differentiated, and so you orient your business model to satisfying that demand as well, and then there are other issues that have to relate to the supply chain, how you manage the supply chain, and the labour standards and environmental standards you use, and how that contributes to efficiency, and how that adds to or lowers costs. And so I think it's just a more sophisticated approach to that, and I think that's fine. I think that's a good vision for a business in the future.
And on the other question?
The other question was the conceptualization question. That I'm not sure of. I'm not comfortable with coining terms in general. There's a long tradition in my field of coining new terms, and I'm not sure about that. I think sustainability, I think we started with this, somebody said something, maybe it was you, Peter, about sustainability and the survival of that as a concept. And I think it's sustainability itself, and I think it's thinking broadly of sustainability, as we did when we thought of a title for this conference, is a fine term. So incorporating sustainability in all these various dimensions into the business model is, I think, a good way of thinking about it.
Rick?
So two things. The first one is, the encompassing model or stakeholder model is a variant of the shareholder model in the sense that the motivation behind it is instrumental. It's good for business. It differs in that who it believes should be benefiting from that is not just one group, shareholders, but a broader collection of workers, suppliers, customers. So that's where it differs. In terms of the stovepipe, I completely agree. We have to get beyond that. We have to completely break down the silos and try to see how CSR, labor standards, sustainability issues, environment are all completely related. And if we break down these silos, we won't be analyzing and trying to solve each problem in its own silo, but stand back, see how they're related, and I think we'll have many more creative solutions as a result.
Katie?
Title CSR, I mean, I always have to pull myself up short. CSR as the CEO of the Business Council means colonial sugar refiners. So we've adopted another term in the Business Council of corporate community engagement, which is just another label. But I agree. I think if you start to twist the model to the point that business doesn't get to do what it's best at, and the two things that business is best at is adding value and spreading prosperity. If you have those as your two underlining themes, and as we've heard from the rest of the panel members, move beyond just the shareholder to taking account that you have got a responsibility to a wider community. I think if you put those together, I think you've got the model right.
Thanks to our speakers. We can restart the clock, have lunch. Please thank our speakers.
Thank you.
Started to gain some currency. You saw companies like Shell, for example, with its experiences in Africa and with the Brent Spar fiasco, starting to take into account the fact that making progress on things like sustainability might be important for their bottom line. Well, the global financial crisis has come along, and in a way this panel is going to discuss what are the consequences of the financial crisis for corporate social responsibility. To some extent, you might say actually the financial crisis is an outcome of corporate social irresponsibility, a failure of the triple bottom line, of a failure not only in financial terms but in environmental terms, long-run failure in environmental terms, and also a less than adequate performance in social terms. And in fact, some of the problems, specific problems which may have caused the leverage crisis, which is the global financial crisis, have been caused by social irresponsibility as well as financial irresponsibility. But I'm going to leave that to the panel to discuss. We're very lucky to have our three speakers. Michael Hiscox immediately to my left from Harvard, Katie Leahy, of course, from the Business Council of Australia, and Rick Locke from MIT. And I'm going to really give it to them to make some opening comments about, as they would wish on this topic, and we'll develop the conversation from there, and I'll involve you as much as possible as well. Michael, just by way of very brief background, is Professor of International Affairs at Harvard and a pioneer in Fieldwork's working group. So Michael, let's begin with you. How do you see this current state of affairs and its impact on corporate social responsibility?
Great, well thank you, Peter. I think there's certainly a skeptical view. You mentioned Milton Friedman and this view that, that firms are only and should only be interested in profits and shareholder value. And the skeptical view that I know Rick and I confront all the time is that the corporate social responsibility, some of the things that we see, not just corporate philanthropy, but firms adopting codes of conduct and looking for ways to have their production and their products certified for ethical standards, good labor standards, good environmental standards, investing in green technologies and so forth, that these are all just PR stunt, that these are all just meant to gain good publicity, and that they're not incorporated into the business model in any real way. And on the other side of the coin, consumers have been attracted to fair trade and green products, but that these are really sort of luxuries that people can afford in good times. And if you believe in either of these two arguments, then you think that the current crisis, the economic downturn, is bad news for corporate social responsibility in any of these kinds of initiatives, because consumers won't be able to afford to pay for these goods, and firms that are only doing this for good publicity in good times won't be able to afford to do that now. I think
well, it's great to be here, and I enjoyed very much the discussion on climate change, and in a sense, I listened hard to that to figure out whether that would cut some of the ground from under our discussion of corporate social responsibility. But given that the emphasis was a lot on what governments are doing and what trade is, what's happening in international trade rules and the like, I don't think there's going to be much overlap. But climate change is just one of the challenges of corporate social responsibility. I remember when I went to business school, I went to the AGSM in the early 80s, and it was impossible to get a discussion going about environmental and social responsibility for business because the general academic climate was very captured of the Chicago school and the Milton Friedman view that the only value that businesses were involved in was enhancing shareholder wealth. At the same time, the Brundtland report started to talk about this strange word, which I thought, as a journalist, was never going to stick, called sustainability. And that was happening parallel in the early 80s. Then, as time went on and also momentum was gathered around climate change, there were the beginnings of books and influence on corporations started to appear more significant. People like John Elkington, who wrote Cannibals with Forks, and who's consulted to Australian companies and organisations a lot.
It's more complicated than that. I think there are some firms that we have done some research with that, that have incorporated these kinds of sustainability initiatives into their business model. And we're trying to do, I know Rick is going to talk about his research, we're trying to do research to sort of investigate what's called the business case for sustainability or corporate social responsibility. And that really, for me, that has two sort of critical elements, and one is, and they're at either end of the supply chain, essentially. So one is in dealing more with the suppliers, and Rick has done a lot of work on this, and what it means when you upgrade labor standards or environmental standards in supplier facilities. And does it, how costly is it to improve labor standards, to give workers better conditions, to better safety and health conditions in the factories? For farmers, if you're sourcing for cocoa or coffee, and a lot of the firms we work with are, how costly is it for you to encourage these farmers to become fair trade certified and to pay a stable minimum price for these goods and a small premium above that price? So working out the costs of these sustainability initiatives, and there's a big debate, a really interesting debate, about whether these costs are actually very high, whether these kinds of initiatives might actually make the suppliers more efficient, more productive. They may reduce rates of worker absenteeism and turnover. In the sort of management side, they may make it easier for you to hire.
On consumers and sustainable products, so is right on the money as far as this discussion is concerned. Best of all, he comes from Tamworth. He's been at Harvard 20 years. He received a first-class honours degree from the University of Sydney in 1989. So his research focuses on international trade, immigration, development, and private sector standards for ethical and environmentally responsible practices. Katie, of course, is the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia. She's been in that role, this is the 100 largest corporations in Australia, since 2001, so she's seen a lot of the debate around corporate social responsibility come and go. She previously worked as Chief Executive of the State Chamber of Commerce in New South Wales. She was Chief Executive of the City of Sydney. She's a member of the board of David Jones and is also Chair of Carnival, the cruise company. And Rick Locke is Professor of Entrepreneurship and Professor of Political Science at MIT and was recently appointed Deputy Dean of the School of Management. He's founder and leader of the Laboratory for Sustainable Business and Society. He works with firms such as Nike, Coca-Cola and Hewlett-Packard, along with his students, investigating how corporate profitability and sustainable business practices can be reconciled. His research team has had access to all their internal audit reports. This is what you lust for if you're an academic. Sourcing databases, and to their current suppliers in countries like China, Brazil, India, Bangladesh, and many more. And Michael and Richard collaborate together in what is the Harvard-MIT Private Governance